Howdy, faithful listeners. Welcome to the Bible Explained and good morning. We're going to be talking about 1 Timothy chapter 3, the qualifications of the elders. And I'm extra excited to delve into this topic because it's one that is of particular interest to me. So we'll get into it in just a moment. All right, so today we're going to be reading 1 Timothy chapter 3, 1 through 7. And talking about how the American church is in a lot of trouble because they don't follow the qualifications for pastors or elders. And we will get into what those qualifications are. There are at least 15 of them. So let's read 1 Timothy 3, 1 through 7. Go ahead and grab your cup of coffee or your cup of tea this morning, and let's go ahead and read this together. As usual, I'll be reading from the WEB. This is a faithful saying. Someone who seeks to be an overseer desires a good work. The overseer, therefore, must be without reproach, the husband of one wife, temperate, sensible, modest, hospitable, good at teaching, not a drinker, not violent, not greedy for money, but gentle, not quarrelsome, not covetous, one who rules his own house well, having children in subjection with all reverence. For how could someone who doesn't know how to rule his own house take care of God's assembly? Not a new convert, lest being puffed up he fall into the same condemnation as the devil. Moreover, he must have a good testimony from those who are outside, to avoid falling into reproach and the snare of the devil. So not to pat myself on the back too hard, but this was the one portion of scripture that I'm talking about with you guys that I haven't had to study in great detail because I've actually done a lot of study on this passage before, just due to the fact that my husband is an elder at my church. And this is what this is talking about. Here's what verse 1 says. This is a faithful saying. Someone who seeks to be an overseer desires a good work. So an overseer is somebody who oversees the church, like a superintendent of sorts. So this could be a pastor, but it also refers to elders as well, because if you turn to Titus chapter 1, verses 5 and 6, it actually uses the word overseer to describe elders also. So here's what Titus 1, starting in verse 5 says. I left you in Crete for this reason, that you would set in order the things that were lacking and appoint elders in every city as I directed you. If anyone is blameless, the husband of one wife, having children who believe, who are not accused of loose or unruly behavior, for the overseer must be blameless as God's steward, not self-pleasing, not easily angered, etc., etc. So that's clear that the overseer can refer to an elder as well as a pastor. And so going back to 1 Timothy 3, Paul goes into the qualifications of the pastors and elders in the church. And the first qualification is that he's a man. Last week, we talked about the role of women in the church, specifically how women can be respectful at church. And the one thing Paul said is that he does not permit women to teach or exercise authority over the men. In other words, he doesn't want the women to be the overseers of the church, especially speaking to new converts of Christianity, where a good chunk of them, a good majority, were actually women coming to the faith in droves. So Paul explains very clearly from the beginning, look, for you women, being a pastor is not for you. God did not design you for that role. And so you should not want or desire that role. And we talked about other reasons as well as to why women should not want the role. And I even explained from my own personal experience, like legitimately, I do not understand how any woman could want to be a pastor because knowing the pastors that I know, that is the most difficult, confrontational job I have ever seen anybody undergo. Not to mention, pastors do that pro bono. You know, they're not getting paid a good majority of the time to listen to people's problems. It's not the same as like somebody going to a, psychologist or a counselor and talking with them, because the counselor is being paid to sit down with that person and figure out their problems. Not to mention, the pastor himself doesn't just deal with confrontation between two people, but they also deal with confrontation being directed at them all the time. People angry at them, irritated over something they said, a lot of times with no real rhyme or reason to it, even. So pastors have a very difficult job, and it's one just better suited for men, as we discussed last week. So here's what Paul says in 1 Timothy 3, starting in verse 1. This is a faithful saying. Someone who seeks to be an overseer desires a good work. So being a pastor, even though it is a hard and difficult job, it's still a good work. Somebody who wants to be a pastor is desiring a good thing because you're essentially giving yourself up to God's ministry. You are becoming a servant for the people. And serving is a very good thing. It's a thankless and difficult job, but it is a good thing. The overseer, therefore, verse 2, must be without reproach. And Paul begins to give a list as to how this person can be without reproach. Without reproach basically means without any accusations being brought against them, like any noticeable wrongdoing that this person is engaging in. And here's the first thing that makes the elder without reproach. He has to be the husband of one wife. So right now, there's this whole movement of polygyny, It's like polygamy, but except the men are the ones that get to have all the wives. And there are Christian polygynists out there who take this verse and they say, oh, that's not really what Paul's talking about. He has to just have his own wife. That's what Paul really means. He has to have his own wife. No, that is not what it says. He has to be the husband of one wife. One wife. That does not mean a wife. That does not mean multiple wives. That means one wife. And this is consistent throughout Scripture. This is not the first time this is found. Whenever we see anybody in a leadership position, God commands those people to have one wife, just one, whether it's the kings of the Old Testament or the leader of the church. They have to be in a monogamous relationship. You can't twist it to make it into whatever you want. This is what Scripture says. You have to be the husband of one wife. So this brings up the question, actually, that a lot of people ask. Well, can an elder be divorced and still be qualified to be an elder? I would not say that that is a black and white issue where across the board, if you've been divorced, you are not qualified to be a pastor or an elder. Because there are a couple situations in which you biblically do not have to remain married or even can't remain married. The first situation is if your spouse just up and leaves. There is nothing you can do about that. That is not your fault. That is on them. That'd be the first situation. And the second situation is if your spouse cheats. Now, as we talked about before in the past with that subject, that does not necessarily mean you have to divorce them biblically, but it is not unbiblical to get divorced in that situation. Of course, Scripture always talks about reconciliation. So if you can be reconciled to your spouse, if you can get past the hurt in your heart, and you see that your spouse genuinely wants to change, genuinely wants to experience life with you once again, even after making an absolutely terrible and disgusting mistake, you can be reconciled with your spouse and not necessarily have to get a divorce. But the reason Scripture gives an out for that situation is because it is so extremely hurtful. And I'm sure many of you listening to this podcast have had somebody cheat on you before, and you understand how gut-wrenching that absolutely is. And so that's why Scripture gives an out for marriages like that, especially if the spouse is unapologetic or doesn't want to really be reconciled with you, or even keeps doing it again and again, like saying, yeah, I definitely want to be reconciled with you. Like, let's give our marriage another go, but then goes off and cheats once again or doesn't change. That's why Scripture biblically says you can divorce your spouse over that type of behavior. And so I would say for a man that's had a divorce because of one of those two reasons, their spouse leaving or cheating, there's an argument that can be made that they should be allowed to maintain the eldership because the divorce wasn't really their fault. It was the fault of the spouse. But some churches do not interpret it that way. It kind of just depends on the policy of the church. Some churches say, if you've ever been divorced, you are not qualified to be an elder. But I think there's an argument that could be made that elders can, in fact, keep being an elder, even if they have been divorced for one of those two reasons. Now, there's one other type of divorce that I would say doesn't necessarily disqualify an elder. And I would say that was before the elder got saved. But he became a Christian after the divorce, learned a lot about what sin was, how to become a healthy husband, how to lead his family properly. I think there's also an argument that could be made for an elder in that situation also not being disqualified from being an elder, even though he was divorced previously. So that would be the three reasons I would say that divorce doesn't necessarily disqualify an elder. But generally, I would guess that Paul is also talking about divorce in this, not just monogamy. Because don't forget the culture that Paul was living in. Remember Jesus, who lived only a short time before this, he was talking to the Pharisees about divorce. The Pharisees came up to him with this question. They were like, so Jesus, is it okay for any man to get divorced for whatever reason? And Jesus was like, no, no, it is not okay for a man to get divorced for any reason. And then they tried to trick him with a question from the Old Testament law, but Jesus, of course, answered it perfectly. They were living in a time period where you just handed your wife a written notice of divorce and you were like, see ya, bye-bye. I'm going to go marry so-and-so over here because she's prettier and younger. That was the culture Paul was living in. And so I'm sure he was combating a lot of that as well, where he's telling his elders, you cannot just divorce your wife for any reason whatsoever. You need to treat your wife the way that God treats his church, by loving her and giving himself up for her. That is how you have to behave towards your wife. So I would say, yes, this qualification for an elder talks about both monogamy and also divorce. You can't just willy-nilly have multiple women in your life and be a biblical elder. You just cannot do it. You have to remain faithful to one woman, and that's it. So moving forward with the next qualification, even though we've been talking about this for 15 minutes now, and we've got 14 more to go through. These will go faster though. The elder must also be temperate in verse 2, sensible, and modest. So when I think of those three words, temperate, sensible, and modest, that always reminds me of money. So somebody being temperate, sensible, and modest with money is not going to overspend, especially church funds. They're going to take care of the money that comes into the church. And even personally, they'll take care of their own finances. They'll be able to take care of their families without going into a lot of debt, without spending money on needless things or wearing overly flashy or showy clothing just to show how rich you were, which was also a problem in Paul's day as well. So they had to be sensible, modest, and temperate. Not to mention they had to be hospitable. So this is a very important one because fellowship comes with food. And you have to be willing to bring people into your home as an elder or as a pastor in order to have true fellowship with those people. As I was reading through this for you guys, I read a little commentary that talked about how Christians would travel back in these days. There were things like hotels and inns, but these hotels and inns in Paul's day often served food that was presented to idols. So it was like idol worship food. And a lot of Christians, didn't feel comfortable staying at an inn where there was idol worship happening. So Christians, a lot of times when they were traveling, would go find other Christians that they could lodge in their homes. And this was a way for Christians to get to know each other from different cities and different countries. So Paul expected the elders and pastors of the churches to open up their homes to the traveler, to the Christians who needed a place to stay. And in this way, you are actually fellowshipping with those people, getting to know them even more. And this also stands true even today. An elder has to be hospitable. He has to be willing to let people into his home. That doesn't necessarily mean that you have to, let somebody live in your house rent-free or take advantage of you, but just not hate guests in your house. Like, just be comfortable having people over for dinner, having fellowship with people, having teenagers have a bonfire in your yard, something along those lines. Just opening up your home for events at the church and getting to know people. That is important for a pastor to do. Now, they also have to be good at teaching, is what it says. And I kind of feel like this is a no-brainer. One of the roles of an elder or a pastor is to actually teach, is to be the overseer of the church. And that, of course, includes teaching and preaching sermons. Verse 3, they also have to not be a drinker and not violent. So a man has to learn to be self-controlled before he can become a pastor or an elder. He has to also not be a drinker. So not just self-control when it comes to aggression, but also self-control when it comes to addictions and things. So not prone to being addicted, like having control over yourself. And this goes not just for alcohol, but any kind of addiction, really. And not greedy for money. Now, if you turn to 1 Timothy 6, verse 10, Paul actually talks about the love of money. It says, "For the love of money is a root of all kinds of evil. Some have been led astray from the faith in their greed, and having pierced themselves through with many sorrows." So if you love money too much, it's actually a snare to you, is what Paul says. It becomes something bad and evil. Now, money in and of itself is not evil, but if you are greedy for it, that is when it becomes evil. And like we were talking about before, a pastor and an elder have to be financially wise with the funds that come through the church, because that is donations from other people. That is tithes from other people. And if the church is just spending all of that willy-nilly with no rhyme or reason on a whole bunch of junk, that's not being a good steward of the funds that are coming in. And that's also a bad reputation for the church. And that's why a pastor and an elder especially cannot be greedy for money, because once they start becoming greedy, that's going to possibly snowball into something even bigger, where they're, skimming a little off the top for themselves or something like that. You got to be very careful. And so a elder and a pastor should not be greedy for money, but they should be gentle, not quarrelsome, not covetous. So not covetous in general, not just for money, but anything. You should not be coveting something that someone else has. The word covet actually goes further than greedy. Covetousness is almost like becoming obsessive over something. Like you want it so badly that you are obsessed about it, and you can't, it's living rent-free in your brain. You can't stop thinking about it. So you can't be covetous if you want to become a pastor and an elder, because you're not supposed to have your sights focused on the things of this world. You're supposed to have your sights focused on God. You're also not supposed to be quarrelsome. So not constantly fighting with people over things that just don't matter. But you have to be gentle. You have to be a man prone to gentleness, controlling your emotions, and being kind towards people. And also in verse 4, it says, you have to be one who rules his house well, having children in subjection with all reverence. And Paul qualifies this one. For how could someone who doesn't know how to rule his own house take care of God's assembly? So in other words, if an elder's kids are destructive and disrespectful and disobedient and rude, if he can't manage his own children, if he can't discipline his own children, who he loves very deeply, how is he going to discipline and reprimand the people of God's church? And that's a big part of the job. Remember how I was talking earlier on this podcast about how being a pastor is like nonstop confrontation? You have to be able to handle that confrontation when it comes in. You have to be able to tell people you are sinning, you are doing something wrong. You need to turn away from this and go on a better path. That is what a successful pastor or elder does for the congregation of the church. And if he can't do it for his own family, for his own little children, then he certainly is going to be terrible at it when it comes to people he doesn't know as well, people he doesn't love as much as he loves his own kids. Now, of course, this goes back to the question. Say an elder doesn't have children. Is he qualified to be an elder? What if he doesn't even have a wife? Is he qualified to be an elder if he is a single man? I would say he's still qualified. And the reason I say that is because Paul himself and many of the disciples were unmarried men without children. And if they were qualified to teach and lead and be overseers of churches in their own right, then certainly a man who is single, who is wise, and who meets all of these qualifications is likely a good candidate to be an elder, even if he doesn't have a family. And then, of course, there's the question of what about adult children who are not following God? Does that disqualify an elder or a pastor because their adult children are off doing all sorts of terrible things? Well, that's a harder question to answer because adults make their own decisions. You know, Ezekiel 18:20, here's what this says. The soul who sins, he shall die. The son shall not bear the iniquity of the father, neither shall the father bear the iniquity of the son. The righteousness of the righteous shall be on him, and the wickedness of the wicked shall be on him. So that verse means that the parents should not be charged with the crime of their adult children. If their children grow up and sin, that is on the kids. That is not on the parents. The parents did not cause their adult child to sin. The child did that themselves. So there is a debate as to whether an elder who has adult children who are not following Christianity, if they should be elders or not. But then, of course, there's also verses in the New Testament that say, train a child in the way he will go, and he will never depart from it. So really, I think it comes down to church policy as to whether a man is qualified to become a pastor based upon the actions of their adult children. Quite honestly, I don't have an answer for that. I do think it could go either way because I think adult children do make their own choices, but at the same time, parents do have a lot of control over their children when they are young. And I've known many people who have grown up to be awesome adults because their parents just trained them very well. So there's a lot of questions and a lot of different paths you can take when it comes to asking questions about these short little verses. But verse 6 here, and this is one of my favorite qualifications. He cannot be a new convert, lest being puffed up, he fall into the same condemnation as the devil. If you turn to 1 Timothy 5, verse 22, it says, lay hands hastily on no one. That means if a new person comes into your church, or if a new convert gets saved, you should not put them in positions of leadership right away. You need to see where their faith is and disciple them before you lay your hands on them or give them a position of power in the church. And this is true across the board, whether it's an elder, a pastor, a worship leader, a deacon or deaconess, they should never be new converts of Christianity or brand new members of the church because a lot of problems can happen. For example, say somebody new to Christianity wants to become an elder. And this church is super excited because they need elders and because this person is interested and he seems like he meets all of the qualifications and he's a nice guy. And the church goes ahead and makes him an elder. What happens then? Well, the second that person's faith is tested, or the second he has confrontation that comes his way, he breaks or he starts doubting his faith. and he starts turning other people possibly against the faith or doing bad things, implementing bad ideas because he doesn't have enough knowledge of the scriptures yet. And this can cause a lot of problems in the church. I've seen this happen where people get really, really excited because they need help in a certain area. And then they put somebody in charge and it turns into an absolute train wreck because that person is not grounded in the truth yet. And the church didn't wait long enough to see if that person was actually grounded in truth. This is where church hurt comes in a lot of times. Putting bad people in charge, not checking their qualifications, not seeing where their faith is, and just putting them in because they need somebody in that position. Terrible, terrible idea. And it happens all the time in tons of different churches across the United States. And it causes so many issues. And not to mention, it's bad for the individual themselves, because here's what Paul says. If you give a position of leadership to a new convert, they may become puffed up and fall into the same condemnation as the devil. Now that, of course, is talking about Lucifer himself, Satan, who was the most beautiful angel in heaven. And Satan, because of his beauty, became very prideful and wanted to become like God. And he fell because of his pride. And the same thing might end up happening to a brand new convert. They may fall into the same condemnation as the devil. They get too prideful because they get a position of leadership early on in their Christian life, and that causes them to fall astray from the faith. It causes them to get too big for their britches, and they fall, similarly to Lucifer. Now, I'm not going to go into whether or not Paul is talking about the loss of salvation here, because personally, I don't think you can lose your salvation. I don't think Scripture teaches that. But I do think that people can fall away from the faith and do all the time and very easily, especially when pride comes in. There's a scriptural verse, I believe in Proverbs, that says that pride comes before the fall. And that's what can happen to a new convert if the church gives him too much power too quickly. Moreover, verse 7, he must have a good testimony from those who are outside to avoid falling into reproach and the snare of the devil. So not only should the elder have a good reputation inside the church, but outside the church as well. To the people who aren't part of the faith, he has to have a good reputation across the board. Because if you have a good reputation inside the church, but not outside the church, that's going to, first and foremost, turn off anybody who is seeking the truth because they see how terrible this pastor is acting outside the church. And they're like, why would I ever want to go to his church? That's the first reason. And secondly, because if a pastor is acting poorly outside the church, that's also going to cause those who hate Christianity to target Christianity even more. And in that way, they will fall into reproach and the snare of the devil, because Satan is doing his best to make the church look foolish in every single way that he possibly can. And a lot of times, it's the church itself giving Satan that power because they're not doing what they should be doing. You know, all of these rules are laid out so clearly in Scripture as to what a biblical elder or pastor is to look like. And how many churches actually follow this? Half of them? A quarter of them? A 16th? Probably not even a 16th of all of the churches in America follow these basic qualifications for a pastor. They just get in, you know, whoever fits their agenda, or whoever says the nice things, or whoever just seems good because they're just trying to get people through the door. The American church is in serious trouble because they don't find people who fit these qualifications. And quite honestly, the pastor and the elder board, they set the stage for what the church is going to look like. So those men better be good, grounded men truly focused on what the Bible has to say. Otherwise, the church is in serious trouble. Well, faithful listeners, thank you so much for tuning in to The Bible Explained and discussing the qualifications of the elders with me. And I'd love to hear about your church and whether or not you think your church follows the guidelines for the elders and pastors. I'd love to hear about all of that because I'm genuinely curious about it. So contact me and tell me, does your church follow the guidelines for the overseers? But faithful listeners, I really hope you all have a fantastic and wonderful rest of your day. I hope to see all of you guys tomorrow morning, 6 a.m. or whenever you choose to wake up. Until then, happy listening and God bless.